بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's nice to be back after a 1 week hiatus. Inshallah, today we're going to be covering only one ayah from Surah Yusuf, ayah number 23. And next week we'll probably cover only one ayah as well. And that is because we are now at that part of the story which describes the attempted seduction of Sayyidina Yusuf by way of the wife of Aziz known as Zulaykha. Now Yusuf alayhi salam is settled in Egypt. He has now attained his full development of strength. By most estimates in this story, he would be between 17 and 20, maybe a little older. Allah Ta'ala knows best. And he's living in Memphis. Memphis was once one of the capitals of one of the ancient Egyptian dynasties, because in that time ancient Egypt was divided into two kingdoms, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and Memphis was one of the capitals of Egypt in that time. We're now looking at the attempted seduction, the murawadah, the attempt of Zulaykha to seduce and tempt Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. This ayah, ayah 23 and ayah 24, both receive more attention in the books of Tafsir than any other verse in the surah. When you go to virtually any book of Tafsir, you find that they devote more time and attention to ayah 23 and 24 than any other verse in the entire chapter. And that is going to be reflected in our tafsir class as well, because of the many issues these two ayat speak about. So looking at ayat 23 today, inshallah, we read the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse. He says, وَرَاوَدَتْهُ الَّتِي هُوَ فِي بَيْتِهَا عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَغَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابَ وَقَالَتْ هَيْتَ لَكَ قَالَ مَعَاذَ اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ رَبِّي أَحْسَنُ مَثْوَايَ إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and she, in whose house he was living, tried to seduce him. Notice in English the uniqueness of this phrase. It's a roundabout way of expressing something. It doesn't say she tried to seduce him, Zulaykha, tried to seduce Yusuf. It says, and she, in whose house he was living, tried to seduce him. And she locked the doors and said, come forward. He said, refuge is in Allah. Surely my Lord has made good my abode. Surely the wrongdoers will not prosper. For starters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the wife of Aziz tried to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam. And he uses the word rawada, which means to seduce or to entice or to seek. It is said that the word rawada has the meaning of mutalaba, to seek. And in this context, it is to seek, to seduce, or to entice, or to tempt. Another thing we notice from this word rawada is that it's on the verbal pattern of fa'ala. And for the students of morphology, of sarf, you learn that fa'ala yufa'ilu mufa'alatan, that pattern has among its meanings the meaning of repetition, of continuity. This implies that her attempt at seduction was not a one-time attempt, but rather it was a part of a process. She repeated time and time again attempting in various ways to seduce him. This implies that she took steps over time to flirt with him, to suggest things, to engage in innuendo, ultimately leading up to this moment where she seeks it in a very direct manner. So it says rawadat in the sense of attempting seduction. So notice that the verse says, she, in whose house he was, tried to seduce him. This is a very roundabout way. It doesn't say she, Zulaykha, attempted to seduce Yusuf, which is very direct. Why does it express it in this manner? Well, before we can answer that, let's answer some other questions. Who is this person to begin with? We have only heard of her as the wife. We don't hear her name in this surah. Who is she, this wife of Aziz? Why doesn't Allah name her? And why doesn't the verse say directly she tried to seduce Yusuf? Why does it use this seemingly roundabout way of expressing that? Well, number one, we know that her name is Zulaykha, not from any verse of Quran, but from hadith reports and other narrations. Her name is Zulaykha. Some of the ulama of Tafsir say that Zulaykha was a title, just as Aziz was a title and not a name. And those who say that it was a title say that her name was Ra'il. And again, these are extra scriptural sources. We don't have any real confidence we can put into those narrations, but they're related in the books of Tafsir. There's a lot to say about Zulaykha, the person of Zulaykha, and what she did and how things unfold, both in this story mentioned explicitly in Surah Yusuf, as well as the details not mentioned in the surah. She has a story of her own. That's what I mean to say. And we're going to get to that story later on. But for now, we just want to note something really interesting. The brothers of Yusuf, they took him and put him in this well. They plotted, put him in the well, and that set into motion this story. And the story of Yusuf alayhi salam in Egypt set into motion the entire history of Bani Israel in Egypt. Likewise, Zulaykha set into motion the details of this story, because it was a result of her attempt at seducing him that ultimately led him to prison, which ultimately led him to these encounters, which ultimately led him to being freed and consulting and using his expertise and knowledge and wisdom and attaining authority in the land, which is eventually transferred to Bani Israel as a whole, until things set into motion where they were eventually enslaved 400 years later. So all of that was from the brothers putting him in the well, in the bigger picture, and from Zulaykha's attempted seduction from another angle. It makes you wonder how many things in history unfold because of seemingly small actions. This person did this, and this happened, and then this happened. Like, think World War I, the assassination of Prince Ferdinand. Ferdinand was assassinated, I think that was 1913 or 14, eventually led to World War I. A whole series of things were set into motion because of that one action. So her name is Zulaykha, according to most authorities, and it's a name and not a title. Now, the second question is, why doesn't Allah mention her by name? The answer is that by keeping her name out of the story, there's an indication that Allah is rebuking her for this attempted seduction by not mentioning her name. It's a sort of subtle rebuke and criticism of her shameful behavior. The second reason why her name isn't mentioned is because we know from the Quran, from beginning to end, that the focus is on the broader moral lessons and not the minute details. There's a reason why we don't know the name of the dog in Surah Kahf, though some have said that his name is Basit. but we don't know his name, nor do we know the lineage of that dog outside of non-scriptural sources. In non-scriptural sources, you'll have some narrations about the dog and the lineage. You even have narrations about the lineage of the pigeons who laid the eggs and had the nest in front of the cave when the Prophet ﷺ was with Abu Bakr. There are actual narrations about this. It is mentioned in the Mawahib al-Laduniya and other collections, narrations that the pigeons you see in the Haram al-Sharif flying around are all descendants of those pigeons. These things exist, but they don't have an immediate bearing to the moral lesson we need to acquire from the story. So there's no need to know her name. Whether we know her name or don't know the name, the lesson is still there. And that's why the name isn't mentioned. Now, about the language, we notice that Allah says, and she, in whose house Yusuf was in, attempted to seduce him. In this roundabout way, Allah describes the scenario. Why is it worded in this way? It is pointing to us that this was not an ordinary seduction, because he is living in her house, he is serving her daily, and she is in charge. So the power balance is tilted in her favor. So it's not just an ordinary temptation. It's a temptation by a woman who has the authority in the house, and the object, the one being tempted, is under the household and is under the authority and is working in the house, serving her. So this points to the difficulty of the situation, the fact that he was under her authority in the household, serving her. And after mentioning that she attempted to seduce him, Allah Ta'ala mentions more details about what she did. It says, وَغَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابِ. She locked the doors. And this is where translations fall apart, because yes, you can translate it as she locked the doors, but it means so much more than that. Because in Arabic, you can say غَلَقَ or أَغْلَقَ for locking a door. But Allah Ta'ala does not use the verb أَغْلَقَت. He uses the verb غَلَّقَت on the form of فَعَّلَ يُفَعِّلُ تَفْعِيلًا. And in Arabic, in sarf, that form has a variety of meanings, but it indicates that there was some intensity in the locking of the doors, that she's locking them with force, indicating her strong desire to seduce him. That's one implication. Not just an ordinary passive locking of the door, but locking the door. So there's a meaning of intensity in the locking. Another meaning implied in غَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابِ is repetition, that is done on more than one occasion. And this could, it doesn't say this directly, but it could imply, based on the verb, that she's locking doors and he's unlocking them and she's relocking them. There's a struggle. That's implied as a possibility in the story. And one of the other meanings for غَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابِ is simply takthir, that there's a lot of locks in the house. Some of the works of Tafsir mention that there were 7 locks in the house. She locked 7 doors in her attempt to seduce Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. And that's not far-fetched, because whose house is it? It's the house of Aziz. It's not an ordinary house. Even in our ordinary houses, how many locks do we have? We may have 3 or 4 in our ordinary homes. Even an ordinary apartment may have 2, maybe 3 locks. This is the house of Aziz, a minister, a person of authority, and he presumably lives in a very large house, a mansion. So it's understood that there will be a lot of doors, and those doors will have locks. So she is trying to lock all of these doors in her attempt to seduce him. Now, the Quran doesn't go into the details of what she did beyond noting her attempt, her locking of the doors, and her request for him to come to her. The Quran doesn't go into the other details because we don't really need those graphic details. Nevertheless, as we've grown accustomed to hearing this, the details may not be mentioned in the Quran, but we do find details mentioned in some of the positions of the Mufassirun, among the Sahaba and among the Tabi'un and among others. Likewise, in this we have narrations that speak about the nature of her flirtation, what she did, how she adorned herself and what she wore. There's narrations that speak about how she was dressing up in her finest attire and perfuming herself and flirting, and even lied down on the bed and called him toward her. These details are not really needed for us, but they're mentioned in the books of Tafsir. The Quran in Surah Yusuf only tells us of her seduction attempt, her locking of the doors, and her saying, Hayta lak. Wa qalat Hayta lak. She said to him, come to me. And in some of the different qira'at, we have Hayta lak, we have Hita lak, we have Haytu lak, and Hitu lak. And this is because that phrase in Arabic is actually an Arabized phrase coming from a Hebrew phrase. And this is what the ulama of tafsir note, that because it was originally a Hebrew phrase, it was Arabized, and therefore it's pronounced in different ways. And the original, they say, is hayyalah. However, it's pronounced in the original Hebrew, and it has the meaning of ta'al, come. That's the meaning, more or less. Come, or come forward. So the ulama of tafsir, they note that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses this obscure phrase in Arabic that comes from Hebrew instead of using something that is more explicit in Arabic, conveying the vulgar nature of her request. The meaning is implied and is understood, but instead of using something that is explicitly vulgar in Arabic, Allah Ta'ala uses an Arabized phrase, haytu lak, indicating that vulgar attempt to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam. So consider what Yusuf is going through here. Yusuf alayhi salam is a stranger. He's in a foreign land. He is in a different culture. They speak a different language. He is alone. His family is far away. He's by himself. And he is a servant in a house. And she is the lady of the house. And he is also a young man who has reached the prime of his strength. Balagha ashuddahu. He reached his prime in strength. And she locks the doors, multiple doors. And she initiates the seduction and lies down and says, Hey talak, come. Imagine what someone would do in that situation and the pressure they're facing. And this is Yusuf alayhi salam. What does he do? How does he respond? Allah Ta'ala mentions him responding in two ways. This verse describes one way, and in a few ayat from now, Allah describes the second way he responded to this. The first response is, he says, قَالَ مَعَاذَ اللَّهِ. That was his first response. He said, مَعَاذَ اللَّهِ. Turning to Allah, saying, Allah's refuge is sought. Now, we are used to saying the phrase, أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ, when we recite Quran. When we say, أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. We are used to saying, أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ in certain morning and evening adhkar. But we're not really used to saying ma'ad Allah, though it has the same general meaning. The question here is, why does Allah mention him saying ma'ad Allah and not the more common a'udhu billah? There's a wisdom in this. First, what's the difference? The difference is that when you say a'udhu billah, you are saying, I seek refuge in Allah, that is called a jumla fi'liya, a verbal sentence. Because a'udhu is a verb. I seek refuge. That's an action, the seeking of refuge. A'udhu billah is jumla fi'liya, a verbal noun, a verbal sentence. When you say ma'adh Allah, ma'adh is a noun. And this is a nominal sentence, jumla ismiya. And in Arabic, we use both of these in our communication. The question is, what is the difference? And which one is more emphatic and powerful in meaning? The difference is that when you say, A'udhu billah, you are speaking about yourself, and it's linked to a particular moment because you're talking in the present tense. Ana a'udhu billah al-an, right? This is fi'l mudari', it's a present tense verb. If you said something in the past, it's a past tense verb. You say it in the future, it's a future tense verb. In any case, the verb is always going to be connected to a doer, the subject doer, the fa'il, the doer of the act, as well as a time, either in the past, present, or in the future. But with ma'ad Allah, that's a nominal sentence. It's not linked to a person, and it's not linked to a particular time. And the basic meaning is, therefore, no matter what happens, in the past, in the present, in the future, no matter who it concerns, me or them or anyone else, refuge is to be sought with Allah. And that is the power of ma'ad Allah, and the difference between it and saying a'udhu billah pertaining to you in the moment. Both of them are beautiful phrases. Both of them are ways of seeking refuge in Allah, but one is not linked to a particular time, and one is linked to a time. One is more open-ended than the other. And that's the difference here. And this particular response tells us something very important about Yusuf alayhi salam and his reaction. The fact that he says ma'ad Allah indicates that he's not rejecting the advance of Zulaykha because he was afraid of her husband. It was because he did not want to displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why his first response was to turn to Allah and seek refuge in Him. When he says ma'ad Allah, though it's not a verb, it's implied that he's seeking the protection of Allah. Just like when you say Allahul Musta'an, that's also a nominal sentence. It's not a verbal sentence. But you can say Allahul Musta'an when there's a problem and you seek Allah's help in solving the problem, right? So nominal sentences are ways of seeking, but it's expressing a reality without an explicit request, but the request is implied when you say it. A lot of our morning and evening adhkar are like this, that we receive from the Prophet ﷺ. A lot of them are statements of fact and not explicit requests. But we're requesting through those supplications. They're implied as we mention them. So he says, ma'ad Allah, refuge is sought with Allah. And after seeking refuge with Allah, he says, Innahu Rabbi ahsana mathwai. Verily, He is my Lord. He has made good my abode. Surely the wrongdoers will not prosper. La yuflihu dhalimun. Now here we come to a very significant difference of opinion mentioned by the ulama of tafsir. As Muslims, we are accustomed to hearing the word Rabb and automatically associating it with Ar-Rabb, Jalla Jalaluhu, Rabbul Alameen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord, the cherisher, the sustainer. However, the word Rabb in Arabic, both in its Quranic use as well as its use in hadith literature, can also imply the caretaker or owner of something among human beings. In Old English, we say the lord of the manor, the lord of the house, meaning the owner, the caretaker, and so on. And that exists in Arabic. In Arabic, the word Rabb has a lot of different meanings. It has the meaning of Malik, of Sayyid, a king or an owner or a master, a Mudabbir, the one who manages the affairs of something, Murabbi, the one who sustains and helps someone develop themselves, Al-Qayyim, the one who upholds and sustains, Mun'im, the one who bestows favor. These are all different meanings for the name Rabb. And undoubtedly, all of these meanings apply to Ar-Rabb, the Lord, Jalla Jalaluhu, as a divine name. But these names can also be used as reference to human beings, people who own things, people who are caretakers, people who are owning slaves, as it was in the past. The slave owner would be the Rabb, and the slave would be the Mamluk or the Abd. And so this points to a significant difference of opinion among the ulama of tafsir. When Yusuf alayhi salam says, Innahu Rabbi, verily he is my Lord, is he talking about Aziz, or is he talking about the creator of the heavens and the earth? You will find ulama who say that Rabb here is a reference to Aziz, and you will find those who say it's a reference to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I wanted to look at the basis for both interpretations and suggest what I believe to be the strongest of the two based on the totality of evidence. Now, those who say that Aziz, the Rabb here is referring to Aziz, that affects the interpretation of what he's saying. If it means Aziz, then Yusuf is saying that he's expressing disgust at the idea of betraying the Aziz who has honored him in Egypt. So he says, Ma'adallah, my Lord Aziz has honored my stay here in Egypt. How could I betray him? That's one possible interpretation. If the Rabb is a reference here to Allah, then what he's expressing is disgust at the idea of disobeying the one who's honored him and made things easy for him in his stay in Egypt, his creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, those who say that the Rabb is a reference to Aziz argue that it's linguistically sound. There's a linguistic argument to be made that the word Rabb in that time and in Arabic as well can be used for the owner of someone who has purchased a slave. And therefore, Aziz is a Rabb in that context. And they say that it was permitted in that time to refer to one's caretaker as a Rabb. They say that this is mentioned elsewhere in the surah when Yusuf alayhi salam is speaking to one of the prisoners. As one of the prisoners is being set free, he tells that prisoner, Uthkurni inda rabbik, mention me in the presence of your Rabb, your owner, your master. So it was in common use in the time of Yusuf to refer to the owner or the caretaker as the Rabb. They say that this was permitted in the Sharia of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, and it was in common use among the people then, even though it is now prohibited for us, because we have a narration from the Prophet ﷺ in which he forbids us from using the word Rabb in reference to a slave-master relationship. In a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ says, لا يقول أحدكم أطعم ربك ووضي ربك اسقي ربك وليقل سيدي ومولاي ولا يقول أحدكم عبدي أمتي وليقل فتاي وفتاتي وغلامي أو كما قال. He says, let not one of you say, feed your Lord, feed your Rabb, to a servant, or wash your Lord, or pour drink for your Lord. Rather, you should say Sayyid or Mawlai. Yani Sayyid or Mawla. The Sayyid means master. but it's not the same as Rabb in the significance here. And he says, likewise, no one should say, let not one of you say, my abd or my emma. Rather, let one say, my young man or young woman, or my young boy, my page or servant, like this. Ghulami. So that position is held by a number of ulama. They say that the Rabb is a reference to Aziz, and it is linguistically sound and established in the surah elsewhere. Other ulama say, no. When Yusuf alayhi salam says, Innahu Rabbi ahsana mathwai, verily he is my Lord who has honored my abode, he is speaking about the creator of the heavens and the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is his Rabb. And their proof, or we should say instead, proofs are many. They say, number one, what does Yusuf say just before he says this? He says, Ma'adallah. He says, Ma'adallah, innahu Rabbi. Refuge is sought with Allah, or refuge is with Allah. Verily, He is my Lord. So the immediate referent is right after saying Ma'adallah. That indicates that he's speaking about his Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not Aziz. And some of them say, whether Aziz treated him well or not, it was still haram. So he's not going to resist the seduction and say, this is shameful because my Lord, my owner, my caretaker has honored me. Whether he treats him well or not, it's still forbidden. So the word Rabb is not pointing to Aziz. And they say that if you say that it's Aziz, it would indicate that he is avoiding this seduction, falling into it out of loyalty to Aziz and not because it was haram. Likewise, continue on in the surah. When you go to the next ayat and the other ayat, you see that he uses the word Rabb again, but it's not in reference to Aziz, it's in reference to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore there is a sense of continuity in how he uses the word Rabb, all of which refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you go to the other passages in Surah Yusuf, whether there are verses before this one or verses after this one, you see that when it mentions the Rabb of Yusuf, and not just Rabb in an open-ended way, when it's mentioned as the Rabb of Yusuf, it's always referring to Allah. In verse 6, verse 23, 24, 33, 34, 35, 37, 50, 100, and 101, every time it says the Rabb of Yusuf is always referring to Allah. When he says Rabbi, never in any other verse is Rabbi referring to Aziz. So it doesn't make sense for this to be the only instant where he says Rabbi and it's not referring to the Creator. This is a very strong argument. And they say, likewise, when you look in the story, look at the person of Sayyidina Yusuf and the person of Aziz. Which one is superior? The answer is quite obvious. We know the superior one is Yusuf alayhi salam. He is a Nabi, which means that he is the most superior. So it's inconceivable, they say, that he, Yusuf, would call Aziz his Rabb when he is superior. And they say that you see a hint of this in Ayah 25, when Zulaykha goes to the door, وَأَلْفَ يَا سَيِّدَهَا لَدَى الْبَابِ, when she met her Sayyid at the door, it doesn't say anything about it being his Sayyid. When Aziz came to the door, it says her Sayyid, her master. It doesn't say his master at all. So that's an indirect indication that the Rabb in this verse, Rabbi, is referring to Allah and not to Aziz. Likewise, and lastly, when we see Yusuf using the term Rabb, he uses it once to refer to one's master. When he says, Uthkurni inda rabbik, mention me in the presence of your master or caretaker. But in another context, he uses it in a negative way. When he's in the prison he puts forward this rhetorical question. He says, أَرْبَابٌ يَا صَاحِبَيَ السِّجْنِ أَرْبَابٌ مُتَفَرِّقٌ خَيْرٌ أَمِ اللَّهِ الْوَاحِدُ الْقَهَّارُ. Are different lords, dispersed lords, arbab, better, or Allah who is one and overpowering? So he didn't use the word Rabb in this context as just master or owner. So what he's saying is, how can I disobey Allah, my Lord, who has showered blessings upon me, granting me nubuwwah, granting me safe passage, granting me a noble place to live with safety and security and honor. إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Verily those people who are wrongdoers will not prosper. So this is a reference to the fact that adultery would be dhulm, would be oppression, would be wrongdoing. And we see here that Yusuf alayhi salam is observing the haqq of Allah, the rights of Allah, in abstaining from zina. He observes the haqq of Aziz by not engaging in zina. And he observes the haqq of his own self by not doing that, because that is dhulm against one's own soul. So he is observing the different huquq, the haqq of Allah, the haqq of a human being, the spouse of the Aziz, and the haqq of his own self and not oppressing it. So we get from this verse an understanding of the intense pressure he was under. The next verse talks about this in more detail in a way that requires a lot of unpacking, because it speaks, we have to reconcile between the infallibility of Yusuf alayhi salam and the nature of the temptation and the possibility of succumbing to the temptation. So we have a lot to say about that. But what we get from this first verse, verse 23, is his instant reaction to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the immediate moral lesson we get. That we have to train ourselves to make the immediate reaction to trials, tribulations, and temptations, ma'adh Allah, turning to Allah. And until it becomes automatic, until it becomes the natural state of affairs, that when we're presented with something, the first response is the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's in North Africa, you have it's the habit in many places that when people do the dhikr, they are accustomed to responding to loud noises or accidents or banging doors or whatever it may be by dhikr. So they'll mention the name of Allah, Allah. So it happened that an acquaintance of mine had moved to Morocco, and he was in a gathering. It was 30, 40 people, and they're in a small room, and suddenly the lights went out. The electricity went out. And he said, as soon as the lights went out, he heard everyone, Allah, like this. And he said he was startled by this, number one. And number two, he was reflecting on how, as they were all saying Allah, he was thinking, oh gosh, where are my shoes? How am I going to find my shoes? And he learned a lesson from that, to train yourself to respond in that way, turning to Allah Ta'ala. We do learn in the next couple of ayat that he didn't limit himself to dua when facing temptation, but he also tried to get out of there. And we're going to learn about that in the coming class. So he made dua at first, but he also took action to get out, which teaches us that we can't resist evil on our own. We have to make dua, ask Allah for divine aid and tawfiq, and take some active steps to get out of the situation. Now, what's interesting in this part, in Ibn Ajib's tafsir, we mentioned about his tafsir a couple of times, how it is a tafsir ishari, a spiritual tafsir. And after he presents the standard tafsir of the verses, which he mostly derives from the tafsir al-Muharrar al-Wajiz of Ibn Atiyah, he mentions some of the spiritual lessons that one can derive from the verses. When he gets to this verse, he talks about the importance of turning to Allah and resisting temptations. And he says that just as Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was tested despite his infallibility, his usma, there are a number of pious, saintly people in our ummah, awliya and salihun, who were tested with similar tests despite their piety. And he goes on to mention a few stories in his own time of people who were tempted. Now, we can mention all of those stories that he mentioned, but the one that stands out the most for me is actually one of my favorite stories. Whenever I would be on the road and I'm asked to give a khutbah, khatibs, this is a secret that khatibs don't tell you. Every khatib has 2 or 3 khutbahs they've memorized that they don't need to review. Because you never know, you could be somewhere and you're put on the spot to give a khutbah, you don't have time to prepare anything. So the one khutbah, my go-to khutbah when I'm in that situation, is a khutbah about the companion Abdullah bin Hudhafa as-Suhami, radiyallahu anh. It's a very famous story. It has a lot of lessons too. But in that story, he's a leader, he's a commander of the Muslim forces fighting in the border area of Byzantium. And this is during the reign of Sayyidina Umar. He was, along with the Muslim forces, captured by the Romans, by the Byzantines, and they were all taken as prisoners of war. And they noticed his great himma, his great will and strength of character. And they wanted him on their side. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to get him to leave Islam and join forces with the Byzantine army. And so they took him and presented him to the Qaisar, the Caesar, the Roman emperor of the time. And when they say Qaisar, there's a chance it could have been one of the governors and not the actual head of the Byzantine Empire. Allah knows best. But in the story, they try to tempt him in various ways, offering him money, threatening him with torture and murder, trying to starve him, all to get him to leave Islam and join forces with them. One of the earliest tricks they tried, they said, let us send a beautiful woman to tempt him. And they sent out into the villages and cities looking for the most beautiful woman they could find. And they found her, and they adorned her, dressed her up very seductively, and they opened the jail cell and put her inside and closed the door. And this is coming from Abdullah bin Hudhafa. He's relating the story after the fact. And it mentions that when she came in, he turned around and saw her. What was his first response? The narration said, Ma'adallah. Ma'adallah, the very same dua of Sayyidina Yusuf. And it says that he turned and went into one of the corners, facing the corner, turning away from her. She comes to the other side, trying to talk to him and sweet talk him and tempt him. And then he goes to the other side. All this time he's making dhikr, A'udhu billah, Ma'adallah. And she keeps coming at him. Remember, he's married, but his wife is in Medina. He's a young man, he's in his 30s. He keeps going through all the corners of the jail cell. And he continues like this until she becomes frightened at this response. This is abnormal. What person responds like this? So she goes to the door, she bangs on the door, let me out, get me out of here. And they let her out, and they say, well, what happened? And she said, as it's related in the story, Wallahi, he doesn't know whether I'm a man or a woman. He's ignoring me to that level where he's not looking, he's turning away from me. And Wallahi, I don't know, is that a man or a stone you sent me to go tempt? His response was that powerful. But it's all turning to Allah. He didn't say, I'm strong enough to withstand this temptation. He didn't say, yeah, I won't fall into anything here. I'll have a conversation. I'll give her da'wah. Let's sit down and I'll give you da'wah. No. You don't give da'wah like this, because they give you da'wah and you succumb. You don't trust yourself in those situations. You trust in Allah. The moment you trust in your own spiritual strength and your own piety is the moment you fall on your face. And that's the lesson we learn from the response of Sayyidina Yusuf, who he's ma'asum. It wasn't going to happen. But even with that, he still turns to Allah. So what about a person who's not ma'asum, not a big wali, succumbs to temptations all the time, is weak in their nature. How do they respond? You have to turn to Allah. If you rely on your own strength, you're going to fall. You're going to fail. You'll fall on your face. And that's the great moral lesson we get from this ayah. Wallahu wa rasuluhu a'lam. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Inshallah, next week we'll be looking at ayah, the next ayah, which speaks about the nature of the temptation and the protection offered Yusuf. We'll look at how we reconcile the infallibility of Yusuf with the possibility of succumbing to it and what has been said along those lines. And then I would suspect that after these two ayat, which require a lot of detail, we'll probably be covering 4 to 5 ayat in each class as the story goes along, insha'Allah ta'ala. So if there's any questions now, we can open them up.
About so al-Zalimun. So if we take the first, the Rabbi as the Aziz, then the Zulm is because it's betrayal.
Betrayal of him, right.
So if we go into the Rabbi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it's the Zalimun, so it's a transgressor. So as if doing this is a Zulm, so can we explore this element?
Yeah, we can explore this. And that's interesting you mentioned that, because if we say that the Rabb, when he says Rabbi, refers to Aziz, the Dhulm or the Zalimun here is a reference to those who wrong, and it's a reference to the betrayal of Aziz. If you say that Rabbi is referring to Allah, then when it says إِنَّهُ لَا يُفْلِحُ الظَّالِمُونَ, it refers to the dhulm against oneself, the dhulm against others. And no, there's no dhulm against Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be wronged in that sense. But Allah ta'ala forbade zina. So there is disobeying Allah when a person commits zina. And it's also a dhulm against the spouse. And it is a dhulm against oneself. So we're forbidden from dhulm on all of these levels. So we observe the haqq of Allah, the haqq of the others, and the haqq of ourselves. Inna li nafsika alayka haqqan, wa inna li rabbika alayka haqqan. You have your body, yourself has a right over you. Your spouse has a right over you. Allah has a right over you. So we have to give everyone their just right. So when you say that Rabbi refers to Allah Ta'ala, there's more possible applications of the objects of dhulm in this context. That's what it appears. Allahu a'lam. You had a question?
Is it possible that Zulaykha was not mentioned in the Quran by name because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgave her for the sin?
Yes.
And then it's not attributed to her anymore?
That's also a possibility, because we will explore her story. There are some narrations that we're going to explore which inform us that Yusuf alayhi salam potentially married her. So that could be a possible reason. The same reason why the identity of the particular brothers who suggested killing are not mentioned, right? Because they were forgiven. So yeah, that's a possibility. Now, Zulaykha's story is interesting on multiple levels, as we're going to see, both in the next couple of ayat and later on. Her story is actually quite pivotal, even though she's not mentioned by name.
The concept of is that a hadith that was mentioned where, was it a narration of Israeliyat where he potentially married?
A hadith. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think you said you mentioned opinion, but I got the impression that you go with Rabbi is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You didn't specify it.
Well, yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, as Joe Biden says, here's the deal. It is not for me to say this is the rajih and this is the marjuh. It's not for me to say this is the acceptable position and this is the unacceptable one, even if I incline to one, and one is ultimately way more convincing to me than the other. And that's because, as some of the ulama say, what pretension there is in the person who says qultu or aqulu in the domain of sacred knowledge. When you read the books of the ulama who have attained the heights of mastery of so many ulum, and they're not just citing narrations, but they're also engaging in tahqiq, verification. They have attained a level where they have an authority to put everything there and weigh it all and say, the soundest view is this, or I say XYZ. But for others who are not at that level, we are transmitting what has been said, even if we have our own inclinations. It's not for us to say aqulu or qultu, I say. This is the position. Now, if a person is seeing both positions and is inclined to one or the other, and they're both within the realm of acceptability, then you're free to choose. We're not talking about something that is, one is acceptable and one is completely unacceptable, and they're both mentioned in the books of Tafsir. Obviously, if it's unacceptable in our aqidah or our usul, we reject it. And we can say, that's rejected and this is accepted. Nay, this is the only acceptable view in the matter. For example, any tafsir that mentions anything ascribing disobedience and sin and ignorance to the prophets, we reject right out of the gate. We don't have to say that's an acceptable position and then the other position is good. No. But when it comes to matters where each of them, both of them are equally plausible, even if we think one is stronger, we don't go around saying this is the only view and you have to take it and you have no choice but to take my position. I don't have a position like that. It's not for me to say. So that's, but yes, Rabbi, al-Zahir, it seems to me that he's referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From the totality of evidence and the qara'in, it would indicate that. But you know how it goes. If you take a position based on what is presented to you of evidence, you may be convinced by it until a heavyweight scholar sits with you and argues why the other position is sound, and I guarantee you'll be convinced that they're right. Right? And it's good to have that happen sometimes, right? To realize the limitations of our knowledge and to learn humility. Yes.
When you were saying that Yusuf alayhi salam later married Zulaykha, is it true for sure, or is it idea or opinion?
It's a hadith, but fihi nadar. There's some discussion about the soundness or weakness of that. Yeah.
So it indicate that Aziz was talaqha or was not in the picture anymore.
Died. Yeah. Inshallah, we're going to explore it. We'll read the narrations, inshallah, and look at what's been said. But that lesson, as you mentioned, Sister Koka, of her name not being mentioned, we do know from those narrations that she made tawbah and she embraced the deen of Sayyidina Yusuf and was guided. And she became a good person at the end of this. No. Khair. وإياكم وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم